So I did my project on nuclear fallout and what its impacts would be today. So what would happen? What we know is that there have been a little more than 2,000 known nuclear detonations. Only two of these have actually been in conflict, which were the bombs that were dropped by the USA on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. What we want to know is what would the damage be with a 1 megaton bomb? And that's the potential that we have. So if we take the population of Keene, for example, which is about 33,445 at any given time, it's a college town, so it's kind of give or take. 30% would die immediately. 32% would sustain major injuries, and 38% would survive. Now, this is taken from the data on this nuke map. I set the yield to 15 kilotons, which is about the size of the Hiroshima bomb, and set it to Keene, center of Keene, which is about Keene State College, which really has an impact because that's where the majority of the population is. The estimated fatalities is a little over 10,000, and the injuries is a little over 10.5 thousand. So how to really look at this is through Apple II, which was part of Operation Q for the United States. This is where they really started exploring, the potential of an atomic bomb. So Apple II was a 29 kiloton atomic bomb that they detonated in the Nevada desert in 1955. It was 2 times the power of Little Boy and 1.5 times the size of Fat Man. It was a fission bomb, so it was nowhere near as powerful as the fusion bombs that had been tested in the Pacific, which were 100 times more potent and measured in megatons. It involved a series of civil defense exercises which focused on the destruction of middle-class suburban homes. This town was then dubbed Survival Town or Survival City. Its purpose was to evaluate the effect of an atomic blast on civilian population, specifically on the items that comprise their daily lives in order to formulate a more effective civil defense readiness plan. The results of this test were then broadcasted to the public and shaped how the general public would live their daily lives in fear and preparedness of a nuclear fallout. So this is how we can really tell how the public would react in the event of a nuclear fallout. How would the government promote it? How would the government protect us? In the case of Survival Town, not very well. If/when a nuclear fallout happens, how would the government be expected to respond? What warnings would they give? How prepared would they make their people? The FCDA advertised to the public while initially a 3-day food supply was recommended, it eventually became a 7-day supply, which then changed to a 2-week supply when fallout shelters, bomb shelters had been created. So the details changed due to society kind of evolving in this nuclear era. The government had sent out brochures and widely circulated the belief that in this context, routine chores such as house cleaning, cooking, consumption became a matter of life and death. They were telling people that you could wipe away the radioactive dust and then eat the food, live in your house, and you'd be fine. Nothing would be destroyed. The food would be very healthy. And this obviously is not the case, but this is what the government was promoting. So furthermore, it says radioactive dust could simply be wiped off packaging, rendering food instantly fit for consumption. The problems here largely revolve around these foods being of considerable surface area to which material tends to adhere tenaciously. It may not be practical to consume leafy vegetables under such circumstances, but ordinary foodstuff usually can be used without any difficulty. Canned material is no problem at all, and even thin wrappings, paper wrappings carefully taken away will yield a content which is perfectly usable. This is what they're promoting to the public. So the public would, act accordingly. We live in a food era, specifically an atomic food era. This mostly came around due to the Cold War. 2 technologies that came to define the atomic age was refrigeration and television. As Americans bought larger and larger refrigerators and freezers, they began to purchase the food that went along with this, which very quickly became normalized elements of the American diet. If we look at this poster here, nourishing meat that comes in cans, this is what was being promoted. This is what the public was buying to survive this atomic era, the atomic way of living as a community. Summarized in 6 reports, canned goods suffered very little physical damage, whereas semi-perishables were severely burned, which accelerated spoilage. Soft packages of sugar flour were damaged by window glass and wood splinters, and upon recovery of food samples about 2 days after the blast, they were all radioactive. Glass containers were particularly radioactive, but were usable 5 days after exposure, and extremely radioactive jars could be emptied and the contents would be found to only be feebly radioactive. So they're saying that even if it's radioactive, it's really not even that bad, which is not true. So Operation Q ultimately failed. It wasn't factual. They weren't really, the government wasn't preparing the United States for what could happen. So it was a flawed social experiment to begin with. While it was designed to improve civil defense recommendations, the 29 kiloton bomb was already obsolete by 1955, and the test houses were painted white to reflect the heat of the explosion. Contained no electrical wiring, no gas pipes, no oil furnaces, so as to reduce the risk of fire, which is not what a typical suburban home looks like. I mean, they need wiring, gas pipes, everything. So it just wasn't realistic. The results obtained weren't realistic. Nor was it mentioned that when the blast hit, everything inside the house, perfume bottles, knickknacks, the toaster, very unfortunately, the dog, turned into a lethal missile, suggesting that no one could actually survive in Survival Town. So how do you defend yourself from this? The article states there is no defense against the atomic bomb. This has been said so often and so empathetically, especially by certain scientists, that a great many people have come to believe it, but it's simply not true. It goes on to state there is a defense against the atomic bomb. It is not a total defense any more than there is a total defense against bullets or against arrows, but it is a defense nevertheless. And a defense which can mean the difference between life and death for millions of people. So yes, there's a defense, but only slightly, and you'll probably die anyway. So you need to prioritize. People in real danger must have absolute priority. It is possible to define pretty accurately who these people are. There are those who live in cities of more than a 200,000 population and in areas with a population density higher than 15,000 people per square mile. So the fear's been depicted. The realization that this tragedy could happen at any moment, defense is not depicted as defense, instead as known casualties, and you have to accept that. So there really isn't a defense, but it's how you move on from that. So odds, the unprepared. The discussion of the prepared versus the unprepared must be had. If this form of apocalypse comes, who will luck favor? And of course we have Edna Mode who says, luck favors the prepared, darling. Edward Teller and Alan Brown discussed the idea that no one can really be prepared for a catastrophic event such as this. How can we apply this to today's society? We have to look at the past. I mean, specifically, how did people behave during the Cold War? How did people behave during Hiroshima? We must call on these examples to understand how one would react today. Times may change fast, but human nature does not. From a cultural aspect, we have the trauma, specifically from the book Escape the Bomb. It's quoted saying, and they had no faces, their eyes, noses, and mouths had been burned away, and it looked like their ears had melted off. It was hard to tell from the back. One soldier, whose features had been destroyed and was left with his white teeth sticking out, asked me for some water, but I didn't have any. I clasped my hands and prayed for him. He didn't say anything more. His plea for water must have been his last words. The explosion results in instantaneous emission of nuclear radiation in quantities that can be lethal at distances up to 2 miles, but since persons in that area would be killed anyway by the blast and thermal effects, this is not an important factor. Far more dangerous is the radiation from radioactive products which are produced in the explosion and which are scattered over the countryside as fallout. So how does fear play into this realism? That's where you have the scientific aspect. Danger is multiplied by the number of nations that have these weapons. A near cataclysm, little published in this country, but reported in the Manchester Guardian of November 28, 1960, which had actually occurred October 5th in 1960, when radar reflections from the moon were erroneously interpreted as a missile attack upon the United States. So you have this concern. Is this country going to fly a nuke at me, or should I retaliate now? And who's first? And that's where you have a lot of these incidents, and this is only one. In the simulation Survival Town, in similar ways that Survival Town was a simulation, engineers used simulation to help prepare and predict different catastrophes. For the purpose of this particular subject of research, we'll look at only the nuclear explosive side of this concept. They have tools that help them predict the effect of these worst-case scenarios on their designs without destroying the expensive physical prototypes. So Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio ran a series of analysis to predict the consequences of a bomb explosion in the cargo hold of commercial aircraft. So even though they're looking at how airplanes can be affected by explosions, the simulation towards the impact of daily life is still the same. They are now using this research to adapt the equipment to have a plane withstand the impact of a bomb, and thus society and being able to build from that. From the New York Times, Williams had come up with a checklist for neo-survivalists prepping for the apocalypse, and this is some of the things he had. So satchels for survival, that's a go bag. Go for the silver. Gold fluctuates too much, and our regular currency is going to be worthless. Alt currencies for the apocalypse, like canned food or band-aids, batteries, stuff that can be easily tradable. Beyond duck and cover, which was something else the government was promoting, just duck and cover from the explosion, you'll live, which obviously is not the case. No place like Dome. Pretty much, very much promoted buying a fallout shelter, a dome. And then pets or meat. Unfortunately, do you save your childhood pet or do you eat it when there is nothing left for you to eat? Summarized, perhaps the most imminent of the list of apocalypses is the nuclear fallout. Given the times and the current leaders, there are many who wouldn't be shocked if the threat was produced. A handful of questions must be asked. How ready are we? Should we be ready at all? How does one prepare for nuclear fallout, and is it even worth it? Would anyone even survive? In this apocalyptic climate, it's difficult to imagine what we would do. However, we can infer, based on the social cultural aspect of the 1950s and during the Cold War, as well as the current state of fear that many people find themselves in today. The idea of surviving nuclear fallout is based off of essentially two concepts: luck and acceptance. We can contemplate the survival rate of a nuclear fallout, but what we should really be doing is looking at how to prepare ourselves for this catastrophic event, if you can even. Um, Survival Town, though faulted in many ways, shows exactly how the government would and did react and how they would prepare for their people, albeit very poorly, but it shows exactly how our government would react and exactly how the people in our society would react. And I believe that's how a nuclear fallout would happen, and that's how society would react to it.